here. I got it? Okay.
Thank you so much for coming, and thank you to Mr. Sakatani for coming today. He's going to give a speech, so prepare your ears for a wonderful speech.
'Now I'm pleased to introduce Mr. Sakatani to you. Mr. Sakatani. Mr. Bacon Sakatani was born in 1929 to Japanese immigrant parents in El Monte, California. In El Monte, he attended a segregated grammar school for Hispanics and Japanese from the first through the fifth grade. When World War II started on December the 7th, 1941, he was 12 years old, and soon after, his father was picked up by the FBI and sent to an internment camp, leaving his mother and 5 children to run the family vegetable farm. In May of 1942, the family was given a 6-day notice to report to the Los Angeles County Fairgrounds in Pomona, kept under armed guards there, there for 3 months, and then the family sent to the Hot Mountain Relocation Center in Wyoming. The family spent 3 years there, and when the Hot Mountain camp was set to be closed in 1945 with the end of the war, they relocated to Idaho to work on a potato farm, and in 1946, they returned to California. He graduated from Pomona High School in 1947 and graduated from Mount San Antonio College in 1949 and was the alumnus of the year for the college in 2012. He served in the U.S. Army in Korea during the Korean War and retired as a computer programmer from Southern California, Edison. Now, let's ask Mr. Sakatani to talk about the experiences of the Japanese American people during the war.
Well, I'm nervous. I haven't had time to settle down. My voice is not so good today. Well, I'm so sorry to say that my Nihongo is not very good. 私の日本語はとってもダメです。Long time ago, we were taught Japanese and we learned words like heta. You guys use that word nowadays? Anyway, so about 80 years ago, I went to Japanese school and I learned a little bit, but we haven't used it too much since. Anyway, let's just go into my slideshow about the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. How do I advance this? That one? Well, how do I back up? That's forward. Okay, I just want to show this one photo. In 1936, my family decided to go back to Japan. Okay, my parents were from Hiroshima, Ken, way out in the country. You know, there's a city called Shobara, and right outside that there's a small town called Yamanouchi. Okay, and so that's where my parents came from. And so in 1936, my family decided to go back to Japan, but it didn't work out. So after just a month or so, we went back to America. And so that's me in the second row, second from the right. And you notice that already in 1936, you know, look at how the boys were dressed, like army uniform. You know, Japan was getting ready for war. And notice another thing. There's 2 rows of boys, only 1 row of girls. Okay, in 1939, I was in the 5th grade. I was born in 1929 in El Monte, California. From the 1st through the 5th grade, all Japanese and Mexicans or Hispanics had to go to a segregated school just for Hispanics and Japanese. Now, this didn't happen all over, but in El Monte and a place like Pionte and Azusa, where there were clusters of Hispanics, the whites controlled the schools, and they said that Japanese and Hispanic will go to a segregated school. And here in nearby Westminster, they had a segregated school there for Hispanics and Japanese. And a Hispanic family took the school board to court, and that's how the school got desegregated in California. Tojo says Jap Army is ready. This is in November of 1941. Tojo is the Prime Minister of Japan. He already is saying that Japan is ready for war. FDR said war may be near. FDR is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the President of the United States. So he is saying war may be near. And so on December 7, 1941, Japs opened war on U.S. with bombing of Hawaii. Now, the war was no surprise. Pearl Harbor was. The FBI knew that the war was ready to begin. They had a ready list of Japanese aliens to pick up soon as the war started. California Jap killed by Philippines. Am I talking too loud? No, seriously, am I talking too loud? No, it's okay? Okay. California Jap killed by Filipino. Okay, now the people are saying, hey, we gotta protect those Japs by putting them into inland camps for their own protection. General DeWitt, he was the commanding general on the West Coast. He didn't want to have another Pearl Harbor on the West Coast, so he started to say, a Jap is a Jap, they cannot be trusted. They must be sent to inland camps. Army order sabotage alert here. This is for the Japanese Americans. The whites couldn't trust the Japanese, so they started to say, hey, we gotta watch out for these people. And so the president acts to end the menace. He signed Executive Order 9066. This stated, in order to prevent espionage or sabotage, certain people can be excluded from the West Coast as a military necessity. It did not say any race of people. Any or all person can be excluded from the West Coast as a military necessity. Japanese submarine shell, Southland oil field. Now there's panic on the West Coast, you know. We had blackouts, you know, and people are saying that Japan is going to invade the West Coast. A couple of days later, LA area raided. Someone spotted an unidentified plane flying over LA. And so 1,400 anti-aircraft guns were shot off. the falling debris in the air, you know, the exploding shell, it fell down and killed 3 civilians. 3 civilians died of heart attack. See? And this all turned out to be a false alarm. But 1,400 shells were fired in the air. We had blackouts, so there's panic on the West Coast. In the inland United States, when the president signed the executive order 9066, rumors started going around all over the inland state that concentration camps will be built in the inland United States to hold the Japanese Americans. So here's this headline: Jap concentration camp set up at Split Rock CCC by U.S. Army. This is in the state of Wyoming. Curfew for Japs. As it says in the center, all must be indoors from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. All Japanese Americans had this curfew. You could not travel over 5 miles without getting a special permit. Now, Minoru Yasui, a Japanese American attorney in Oregon, he felt that this order was illegal. So he stayed out beyond the 8 p.m. curfew, got himself arrested, taken to court. He loses. He appeals to the Supreme Court, and he loses there also. And so the registration of all Japanese Americans for the coming evacuation into the camp started. Gordon Hirabayashi at the University of Washington, he felt that this order was illegal, so he did not register. But he is picked up, taken to court, he loses. He appeals his case to the United States Supreme Court, and he loses there also. So on April 1st, 1942, Army will move 5,000 Japs by end of week. On April 2nd, Jap ordered on a Bay City port area in all of San Diego. On April 3rd, exodus of Japs from harbor to start today. 3 successive days of these top headlines made everything seem legal. There are no protests from the Japanese Americans. You know, they're not paying anything. And so everything seemed legal. Underneath the headline on the right, it says, Santa Anita Center will receive 500. At the Santa Anita racetrack in Arcadia, the huge parking lot, they had these barracks. It held 19,000 Japanese Americans there. They had guard towers with machine guns. Some people were put into smelly old horse stalls. They took even World War I veterans, Japanese Americans who served in the U.S. Army during World War I, they were ordered to go to the camps. They took even orphans out of orphanages. They took tubercular patients out of hospitals. People with heart problems, they took them out of the hospital. Now, Fred Korematsu in the city of Oakland, he was in love with a white woman. He didn't want to go to camp, so he hid. He even got an operation on his face so he wouldn't look like a Japanese. But he is caught, he is taken to court. He tells the court that this whole thing is illegal. He loses. He appeals his case to the United States Supreme Court. Japs will go to Pomona Fairgrounds Camp. That's that Los Angeles County Fair in Pomona. Okay? This is the order that would put me into the camp. Instruction to all persons of Japanese ancestry. This order came out on May 9, 1942. It said, to all persons, all aliens and non-aliens. All aliens and non-aliens. That covers all of you, right? They did not have to mention American citizens, because American citizens were non-aliens, right? So all aliens and non-aliens. On May 9, 1942, they told us to report to camp. On May 15, 1942, they gave us a 6-day notice with only what you can carry. Whoop. Okay, it doesn't back up. That. I'm so sorry. Okay. Okay, so when we reported to the Pomona Assembly Center, the first thing they gave us was a canvas bag. We filled it up with straw, and that was our mattress, because we couldn't take mattress with us. You know, only what we could carry. And so they gave us a mattress filled with straw. And I remember at nighttime we had a 10 p.m. curfew. A policeman will come to the barracks and give us, a checkup, with a flashlight. And that place we couldn't escape. We had these high fences. Now in Wyoming, the governor of Wyoming said they will not take Jap aliens only if they are under U.S. guard, only if they are put into concentration camp. You see, at first, the U.S. said they will make reception centers in the inland United States. No armed guards, no fences, but the people in Wyoming, or all those people in the interstate, complained. 10,000 Japs to be interned here. Concentration camp ordered on Heart Mountain Irrigation Unit. And so in Wyoming, I was sent to the Heart Mountain camp on top there in Wyoming. We had 10 of these permanent relocation centers. Pomona and Santa Anita were temporary camps, while more permanent camps were being built in the United States. Construction started on Jap camp here, okay? The camps were called Jap camps. 3,000 workers were working 2 12-hour shifts a day. They had a 60-day contract to finish the camp. And in 62 days, they finished the camp. And so we, at the Pomona camp, were loaded on train and shipped to Wyoming. I remember when we passed through town in the train, the military police would come around and tell us to pull down the blinds. They didn't want us to see outside, but more importantly, when the people on the outside saw Japanese in the train, they were throwing rock on the trains. So here we are arriving in Wyoming with only what we could carry. There were 127 soldiers there to guard us. Now, we haven't been charged with a crime. We had 9 of these guard towers surrounding the camp. There were 6 more out in the hills. There were 15 of these guard towers. Now, I just turned 13 when I got to the camp. No one told me that I was guilty of any crime. I knew that my parents were Japanese aliens, so I'm just tagging along with my parents, and I'm just tagging along, just observing. I'm just a kid. I didn't know anything. So when I saw the guard towers, at nighttime with searchlight, it was very exciting. So this turned out to be a big adventure. So here's a view of the camp. We had 450 of those buildings. They were called barracks. And then 1 square mile, we had 10,000 Japanese there. We became the 3rd largest city in the state of Wyoming. One of the person interned with us was a white woman. She was married to a Japanese, so she volunteered to go into the camp with us. She drew what was happening. And so here's one of her drawings of inside the barracks. Now, the barracks were 20 feet by 120 feet. It had 6 rooms. For a family of 2 or 3, the room size was 16 feet by 20 feet. For family up to 5, 20 feet by 20 feet. For family up to 7, 20 feet by 24 feet. If you had a larger family, you would get 2 rooms. Each room had a coal-burning stove, a single light bulb. Okay, there were no toilets or no kitchen or nothing. It was just a room to sleep in. The ceilings were open so that you heard the noise of everyone in the barracks. People snoring or arguing or, baby crying. You heard all the noise. Now, this is a photo I took recently. Behind the stove was a 8-foot by 8-foot piece of asbestos. And we used to wipe it, and all the dust would fly around. But in those days, no one knew the dangers of asbestos. Oh, but we lived through 3 years of that every day, and it was next to the hot stove. You know, asbestos is fireproof, you know. So here's a photo of inside the room. Notice some of those little furniture, they were made by scrap lumber. See? This is inside the mess hall. This is like a cafeteria. Okay? We were fed 3 meals a day. It was costing the government 15 cents a meal for each person. This is where the family life ended. Okay, like all of you kids, you're not going to go eat your meal with your parent, your foreign-speaking parents. No, you want to go eat with your friends, right? All the teenagers ate by themselves. You know, all the old people ate by themselves. And this is where the family life ended. This is the women's restroom. The toilet bowls are on the right. At least they had a partition in between the bowls, but they have nothing in the front. This is the shower room. This is the men's room. See, on the toilet bowls on the right, we had no partition. So it was like this. Well, for teenagers, what's the difference? You know? But I couldn't do this today. This is the shower room. Oh. Oh. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay, was that come on? The bottom one? Okay. Okay, so this is the shower room. We made the wooden bathtub later. Now, we were paid for the work we did in the camp. That's hard to believe. And you know, they used us to run the camp. Okay, we had these white administrators. You know, they just worked in the office and they ran the camp, but all within the whole camp area, all of us did everything. You know, we did the cooking and all the truck driving and dumping all the coal and everything. See? And so we were paid for the work we did in the camp because the only thing the government gave us was 3 meals a day and a place to stay. We had to buy our own clothes, you know, Kleenex or toothpaste, all of that kind of stuff we had to buy. Okay? And so for the unskilled workers, they were paid $12 a month. Semi-skilled, $16 a month. And skilled, like doctors and dentists, they were paid $19 a month. Because the buck private in the Army was making $21 a month at that time, and we could not be paid more than the buck private in the Army. And so later on, this became a point of a lot of friction. You know, we working for all these, that low wages, and the whites working in the administration area, they were making several $100s a month. See, so later on, it got to be a big problem. You know, we had our own timekeepers, for instance. You know, the timekeeper will check a person in, and the guy will be goofing off the rest of the day. What's the difference, you know? You let the prisoner keep time for the other prisoners, that's what's going to happen. People delivering food to the mess hall, you know, they're delivering food to the mess hall, but they're also giving food away to their friends. And then when they're driving along, they will stop and be goofing off somewhere. That's the psychology of the people, you know, that's how they became. At first they were hard workers, but when you get a bunch of prisoners, getting prisoner wages and treated as prisoners, it just went to heck, So here's the truckload of coal being dumped. There was a shortage, so people were fighting to get their fair share of coal. They were hoarding them in their own barracks. It got to be like 30 degrees below zero, so it got to be very cold. We had our own fire department. We had our own police department. Of course, they're not going to go around arresting their own friends. They're just there for looks. We had our own doctors. We had our own nurses. We had a 125-bed hospital. It was said to be one of the finest in the state. That's what they said. I guess it's good publicity. We had our own dentist. We had our own school, but the first year we met in the barracks, so we had no books, no blackboards, no nothing. So the first year was a total waste. That white teacher on the top right, we hired the white teachers from the outside. Now, after a couple of months there at the camp, the white people on the outside started to complain that, we were roaming around the area there. And they said, oh, you gotta lock them up good. And so the administration started to put up a barbed wire fence around the place. Now they used us. And so we started to put up the barbed wire fence. And then we thought, oh my God, we're putting up a barbed wire fence to coop us in. So they all quit. And so the Army had to finish putting up the barbed wire fence. $100,000 war industry plant to be built here. Outside company wanted to use the inside labor. There was 10,000 people there. There could be some skilled worker locked up. And so they proposed a $100,000 war industry plant to be built here. Work start next month on a $140,000 high school. $10,000 community Christian church plan here. An outside Christian group decided that, they would fund a Christian church inside the camp. Now, we also started this newspaper. It was 2 cents a copy. The first edition was sent to President Roosevelt. The second copy was sent to the head of the War Relocation Authority. That was the mentality of us Nisei in those days. Giving the first copy of the newspaper to the President of the United States. Hey, ceramics plant to get modern building, an 8-lane bowling alley with a fountain service. These are all, planned. It's just a big publicity here. Now, there was a tremendous shortage of workers on the outside, okay? All the white workers were now working in the defense factory, or they were in the armed forces, okay? So there was a big shortage of farm workers. And so they let the able-bodied workers from the inside of the camp to go outside and work outside. When they went outside, they were given the outside wages. And then when the harvesting was done, then they reported back to the camp. We were allowed to go outside to the nearby town. But some of those people didn't want us there. They had these no job signs. The first winter came, we had ice skating. Oh, we people from the Southern California went crazy over this because we never saw snow, and so we just scraped up an area, flooded with water, and we had ice skating. Oh, we went crazy over this. Where do you think we got the ice skates? There were no big department store in the camp. from the mail order catalogs of Sears, Roebuck, and Montgomery Ward. They did a landslide business. Now, one of the reasons that the state of Wyoming wanted a camp there in its state was to finish these unfinished work projects. Due to the war, there were no more labor to finish like this irrigation canal system. And so they used us from the camp to finish this huge irrigation canal system. And so that water came to the camp. We had like a 2,000-acre vegetable farm. There we're harvesting Japanese radish, daikon. Here's a nice crop of tomatoes. We even had a hog farm and produced our own pork. Now we should buy all the food material from somewhere else. See, when we bought it locally, the local people were complaining because there was a food shortage, throughout the United States. And so it was up to us in the camp to produce our own food as much as possible. Here we have the millionth egg. So we had a huge egg laying farm there. Oh, I got so sick and tired of egg foo young, I still will not eat it to this day. Now, juvenile delinquency was a big, big problem. We teenagers had nothing to do. There was no recreation. There's no sport equipment or nothing. So we just ran around in gangs and, we were just fighting. And so the authorities realized this. So right away, they started to get all kinds of sport equipment. They organized and put us into a football league, baseball, basketball, to keep us busy. We had Boy Scouts. They rounded us up and put us into these programs because there was too much juvenile delinquency. The Boy Scouts needed a place to pass their swimming test. And so we all dug a huge hole and we filled it up with river water. And this is where I passed my Boy Scout swimming test. Finally, the 140,000 high school was built. All others, that $100,000 defense plant, and the ceramic plant, the bowling alley, the church, they were all canceled, because the people on the outside started to complain. Hey, this is supposed to be a concentration camp. They were trying to make it too fine, and people wouldn't leave. So here's the nice high school orchestra. I don't know how they got the equipment. I think they, I don't know, they must have got it from the town there. Our high school had a football team. Okay, so we joined the outside league. And in 1944, we were the conference champion. We could have been the state champion, except we lost our last game. We had a basketball team. We usually lost, we were so short. Now these group of nurses, you know what they did? They didn't like that white woman on the front row. Those nurses said, oh, she's too much of a dictator. And so those nurses went on strike. And so they forced the white woman out of the camp. We had a orchestra. There's a lot of people in the camp there. And so we had our own orchestra. Now, there's small towns around the camp area, on the outside. They used this orchestra to play for them. This is a Japanese cultural event. Now, before this kind of event was put on, they had to be censored. The white official had to look them over to be sure that it wasn't too pro-Japan, trying to show propaganda on the Japanese part. But we had these kind of things all over the camp. Now, where do you think these nice kimono came from? Well, some they made inside the camp. But after we got to Heart Mountain, those people who had their belongings stored in government warehouses, they were allowed to send for them. Okay, and so that's how most of these kimonos came into the camp. Here's a Japanese sewing class. This is, I don't know, who can read that top line there? See, my father is on the top row, way on the corner. That's my father. I don't know what kind of class this is. But we had all kinds of class all over the camp. You see, we have 10,000 people, crammed in 1 square mile. And so therefore, everything is within walking distance. And many of the housewives, they had no jobs. And so, everybody just got together and formed a sewing class, singing class, all kinds of things. People like my family was out on a farm. We lived far apart. There's only one family per block. So now, my parents were able to participate in all kinds of Japanese cultural activities. So now these old men, they get to play Japanese chess. Now, there were too many Japanese in the camp who were pro-Japan. They wanted Japan to win. They were saying bad things about America. And so these people were thought to be disloyal. Okay, and so the government decided to segregate all those people who were pro-Japan. They put them into a separate camp by themselves. So out of Hot Mountain, 900 persons out of 10,000 people were segregated to another camp. And this is where all the troublemakers were sent. So the Hot Mountain camp was sort of a peaceful place. See, what's really offensive are those clubs. Boy, that looks mean to me. Here's a boxing event. Judo. Now the old folks, they never had a chance to have a recreation. All they did was work all their lives, and now here they were idle in the camp. And so now these people got together and were able to enjoy some relaxation. Well, it was a big vacation in a prison camp. Oh, I'm sorry. I got it. We had 2 movie theaters. See? We fixed up the barracks, and we had hard wooden benches. And so we had very old movies. 5 cents for the kids and 10 cents for adults. Churches. People living on country, in the rural district, they had never had a chance to go to churches. And so we had many churches in the camp. The only church that was not allowed was the Japanese Shinto religion. But we have many other religions, many Buddhist churches. This is a Catholic church. Now, Wyoming has a law that states American citizens living in the state of Wyoming for 1 full year become a citizen of Wyoming, and they could vote. And so the state of Wyoming knew this. And so there's 10,000 people in the camp. 2/3 were American citizens. And so to stop us from voting, Wyoming passed a law that stated American citizens brought to Wyoming and placed in a concentration camp cannot vote in the state of Wyoming. Selective service opens for Nisei. Selective service means the drafting of young men into the army. Now, when the war started, the drafting of young men into the army of Japanese Americans was stopped. They were classified as 4C enemy aliens. Some Japanese in the army were kicked out. But now in 1944, the drafting of eligible young men into the Army started. 63 people refused to report for their physical. You know, they demanded their constitutional rights. Each person testified to that in the court, that, you know, they were unfairly put into a concentration camp. If they were going to be put into the United States Army, then they wanted to be treated just like all other U.S. citizens. They lost their case. They were sent to prison for 3 years. Now here are the people who are reporting to the Army. See that sign in the center? It says, at that time there were 361 in the U.S. Army. There are 2 women with 4 stars apiece. That meant they have 4 sons apiece in the U.S. Armed Forces. This is an honor roll. This is where the names of all those serving in the U.S. Armed Forces were kept. By the time the camp was closed in 1945, there were 800 names on that honor roll. Bokoku Yorino Imonin. I could read a little bit. What that means is a gift from Japan. Now, in Japan, they heard about us in the camp. You know, they thought we were prisoners of war. And so Japan sent a boatload of shoyu, soy sauce, miso, tea, you know, to the camps because, you know, they thought we were prisoners of war. And so here, this is where it came to 1 block. And so several hundred of these kegs of shoyu were sent to our camp. And so for all the 10 camps, you know, there were several thousand of kegs of shoyu, miso, and tea sent to the camp. And in return, the United States sent, you know, Red Cross food items to the prisoner of war camps in all of Asia. And so in 1944, the Buddhists thought they would have a Obon festival. Sumo. A Christmas party. Giving out gifts. Where do you think these gifts came from? You know, many in the camp were very poor. The white churches on the outside found out about the camp. And so they collected, you know, a whole bunch of gifts to give to the people in the camp. And they sent it to our camp, and we distributed them during Christmas. Bunch of Boy Scouts. That's me in the center with a white jacket. Where do you think we're at? In Wyoming. Yellowstone National Park. Would you believe it? The camp director felt that we youngsters were not getting the American way of life cooped up in a concentration camp. And so the camp director knew the head of Yellowstone. Yellowstone was vacant, you know, it was empty. There was gas rationing. And so 500 Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts spent 1 week at the Yellowstone National Park. This was the highlight of my stay at the Heart Mountain Camp. Mrs. Shiramizu, she is a war widow. Her husband was killed fighting for the U.S. Army in Europe. She wanted to return to the West Coast, so she sued the United States Army. The Army knew that sending us to the camp was illegal, and so they gave permission to Mrs. Shiramizu to return to the West Coast. Now the war with Japan was still going on, and by the end of 1944, there are 1,500 Japanese Americans living quietly on the West Coast. Army Enlist Battalion Japs Return. This came out on Sunday, December 17, 1944. Why did they announce that we could go back to the West Coast on a Sunday, December 17? On Monday, December 18, 1944, the Supreme Court announced two decisions. In the Korematsu case, this guy here didn't want to report to the camp. He hid. He didn't report to the camp. Okay? He was found guilty for not reporting to the camp like he was ordered to. A dissenting judge, a Supreme Court justice, said, "This is the legalization of racism." In the other case that was announced on December 18, 1944, the Mitsuo Endo case. She was an employee of the California state government. When Pearl Harbor came, she was fired from her job. When she was told to go to camp, she reported to camp. But when she was at the camp, she was checked out by the FBI, and she was found to be a loyal American citizen. Her brother was in the Army. And so the Supreme Court said, you cannot keep a loyal American citizen in a concentration camp. She must be released and treated just like any other American citizen. She can go anywhere in the United States. And so, I gotta get the next one. Supreme Court rules loyal NIPs held illegally. See, Japan was also called Nippon, and the people there are called Nipponese. And so we were also called NIPs. And so they ruled that, they were holding her illegally. And so beginning January 2nd, 1945, we were allowed to the West Coast if we wanted to. But not many people returned to the West Coast because the war is still going on. There's a lot of discrimination. People who went back couldn't find jobs. Their homes were set on fire. And so most people remained in the camp for the duration of the war. They even had a conference of all the camps. They got together to try to tell the government to keep at least one camp open. The camps were all set to be closed. But the people all got together trying to keep at least one camp open. Like at the Heart Mountain camp, there were 11 old men, they were invalids, they were under care. Where would they go? Now here's this is actually Estelle Ishigo's husband. He's holding 3 nice trout. We were allowed to go fishing at the nearby river. But the Caucasian on the outside, they didn't like this. So they passed a law that stated, American citizens brought to Wyoming and placed in a concentration camp cannot buy a fishing or a hunting license. Joe Hayashi, he volunteered into the Army from Pasadena. Just before the war ended, he is killed in action. He received the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest award from the military. In 1996, the Army is ordered to investigate why only one Japanese American received the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award. And so in the year 2000, here's President Clinton awarding the Medal of Honor to Joe Hayashi's sister. It was through discrimination that Japanese Americans did not receive the Medal of Honor except one during World War II. And so at this ceremony, 20 Japanese Americans received the Medal of Honor. That includes Senator Dan Inoue, sitting on the lower left there. James Okubo, he volunteered into the Army from the camp. For his bravery, he was recommended for the Medal of Honor, but instead he received the Silver Star, the third highest award. So at that White House ceremony in the year 2000, President Clinton awarded the Medal of Honor to his widow. Why did we stay in the camp until May of 1945? To finish the high school year. Here is the high school graduation class of 1945. We got all those cap and gowns from the outside. Hart Mountain to close November 15. No one's leaving the camp. You know, they have no place to go, no money. And so, to force the people out of the camp director set a deadline. It's going to close at November 15. You better make plans to get out. And so the forced evacuation of the camp started. You know, people were being sent back to wherever they came from. They were given $25. And they said, if you don't make plans, we'll make plans for you. If you don't pack, we'll pack up for you. So here's Estelle Ishigo. She said she's going to remain to the end and record what's happening. In reality, she had no money, no place to go. She drew this full picture. In August, Hiroshima is bombed, and so the bad news comes to the camp. There's a joy and celebration throughout the world that the war is now coming to the end. But in the camp, it was a day of sadness because many people in the camp have relatives in Hiroshima, and these people knew that now the war has ended, the camp will close. But these people had no place to go. And so the forced evacuation out of the camp continued. Those people who refused to leave, the government started to close up the mess hall and they had to line up in the snow. They started to ration the coal. And so on November 10, 1945, the camp was closed. Okay, I just want to show you a couple of photos of what I'm going to talk about soon. When Little Tokyo in Los Angeles, was empty, all the Japanese people left, then the black people from the deep south came in. See, they had no place they came to the West Coast to find jobs. Okay, so places like Little Tokyo was empty. And so they started to fill up. Places like the church, hotels and everything. People just crammed those places and they took over Little Tokyo and it was called Bronzeville. Okay, so now with the end of the war, all these people, they're going to be kicked out because of the returning Japanese. And so the returning Japanese are now going to take over places like this. This is the trailer park. Okay, see right next door is a factory. Okay, all these people were coming to the West Coast where the defense factories were. And so the factories were having put up these trailer camps to house all these workers. But now the war is over, all the defense factory workers have left, and this is where they put all the returning Japanese. And so here's Arthur Ishigo. They had no money, no place to go, and so they ended up in this trailer park. This is Estelle Ishigo. I was asked to find her in the 1980s, and so I found her. She was penniless. Both of her legs were cut off below her knees due to gangrene. She had a very, very sad story. And so a filmmaker made a documentary on her life. And in 1990, that documentary won the Academy Award. This is me. I graduated high school in 1947. Before this, I went to Idaho. I'll talk about Idaho later. I just want to show this photo. When we came back to the West Coast, we had no place to live. So we lived in a tent. And we looked around and we found this broken down farm in Pomona. See, the farmer, in order to get out of the army, farmers were exempt from the army. So the guy was farming to be exempt from the army, but he had a restaurant in town. And so we found this farm, and we lived in that shack. And this is the way the house looked like. This is another farm, but this is the way our little house looked like. You see that thing in the center? That's how we washed our clothes. You know, we built a fire underneath the wash tub because there were no appliances. You know, during the war, no appliances were made. And so right after war, you know, refrigerator, all those kind of things were not available. So I remember I had to build a fire underneath there for that wash tub so that my mother could do the laundry. So here I am in 1947 in this little shack there. That's a Japanese bathhouse called a furoba. You know, inside was like an oversized wash tub. You know, a tin thing that's about 3 feet wide and maybe 4 or 5 feet long. And we put water in there, and then we would build a fire, and that's how we had our bath. And so here, that little shed on the left there, see, that's what's called a furoba. And right next to it, you see a stack of firewood. Okay. Here's the Wyoming law that was passed in 1943 to prevent us from voting in the state, since we were the third largest city in the state of Wyoming. After residing in the state, American citizens, they become citizens of the United States and they could vote. And so they passed this law. Every person shall be qualified and entitled to vote who is a citizen of the United States, and provided further that each citizen of the United States who has been or is hereafter brought into the state of Wyoming and who is now hereafter interned in a relocation center or concentration camp shall be prohibited from voting in any election in the state of Wyoming. So the word concentration camp was not that such a bad word in those days. It was meant to mean an ethnic minority group, you know, put behind barbed wires and guarded. That was the definition of concentration camp in those days. And so it was widely used. President Roosevelt used it. You know, the Supreme Court Justice said, you know, relocation center is an euphemism for concentration camp. That was written in their opinion. See? And so the word concentration camp was freely used. Here's the law that was passed to prevent us from fishing. Any citizen of the United States shall be entitled to a resident hunting or fishing license, provided, however, that any person who has been or hereafter brought into the state of Wyoming, who is now hereafter interned in a relocation center or concentration camp, shall not be entitled to a hunting or fishing license or permit. Life after camp. Okay, so in 1945, the camp was proven to be illegal, and the government had to close up the camp. So my family had no place to go. My father worked one time in the fields of Idaho, so he found a job there. We were given a very small house, just a very small house. It had electricity. It had no natural gas. The cooking stove was a coal stove. That's the only stove that heated the house. We did the cooking on it, and then when we had to take a bath, then we put buckets of water on top of that coal stove, and then put hot water into a wash tub. Our drinking water came from the irrigation ditch next to the house. It went from a small pipe to a concrete cistern under the house. That water came from the river. I remember one day they shut the water, for maintenance on that ditch. And I found puddles of water in this irrigation ditch. I found trout. That's our drinking water. Oh man, we had pretty good dinner that night. And then we had the outdoor outhouse, and of course the first Halloween, the white kids in the neighborhood, they came around and pushed it over. So winter came, there were no more jobs, so we went back to California. We tried to get our old farm back. We couldn't find a place to stay, so we got a tent. So we lived in this tent. I can't remember how we survived. But anyway, we found this farm in Pomona, and those photos I showed you, how we lived. Boy, it was really tough. This is one area that we don't want to talk about. We could talk about the camp and we could joke about it today, but boy, the time that, we had right after the camp was really tough. I remember going to school. My sister and I were the only Japanese. I remember eating my lunch out in the football field all by myself. And then my senior year, when I had to give a talk in my class, boy, that was really a scary moment. I went up in front of the class and I said, I am an American too. And I told them, how I grew up went to a segregated school for Hispanics and Japanese before the war, how I went to the camp, and how I got back to California. And here I am, an American citizen. I still remember that title. I am an American too. Well, I sure wish I could go back to that class. I tell them, I went to the college nearby, I went to it, and I served in the Korean War, and I became a staff sergeant. Boy, I sure wish I could go back and talk to my class again. Well, anyway, during the late 1970s and 1980s, the drive to redress the wrongs that were inflicted upon us caught on with the Japanese Americans. And so we forced Congress to have this commission on wartime relocation and internment of civilians to find out what happened during World War II. So they got a hold of the living Caucasian officials of the camp, They went into the secret documents during the war. They, 750 persons testified before this commission. And here is their result. This is a governmental body. The broad historical causes which shaped these decisions were race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. Widespread ignorance of Japanese Americans contributed to a policy conceived in haste and executed in an atmosphere of fear and anger at Japan. A grave injustice was done to Americans, citizens, and resident aliens of Japanese ancestry who, without individual review, were excluded, removed, and detained by the United States during World War II. Oh, I'm losing my place here. Okay. In 1944, General DeWitt had to justify why he put us into the camp. So he produced this report called Final Report, Japanese Evacuation from the West Coast, 1942. This was used in the Supreme Court where Hirabayashi, Korematsu, and Yasui lost their cases. 40 years later, an archivist was looking around the Washington, D.C. archive and stumbled upon a copy of the final report. She looked through it and found it a little bit different from the copies that were available to the public like this one. And so Professor Peter Iron of San Diego State University, through the Freedom of Information Act, found out why that one copy of the final report was different. He found out that in 1944, General DeWitt had 10 copies of this report printed. He sent them to the lawyers at the War Department. Now the lawyers found errors. And so they went to the printing presses and made 55 changes to the original final report. They had 10 new copies of the final report printed. They ordered the 10 original report destroyed, but one copy did not get destroyed. And so with this newfound evidence of governmental wrongdoing, Professor Peter Iron, who is also a lawyer, took the government back to court. Now, you can't take anyone back to court after 40 years. But there is a rare procedure called the writ of error coram nobis. And so on January 19, 1983, the coram nobis proceedings were started. On April 19, 1984, Korematsu's conviction was vacated. Korematsu's decision was not overturned. You cannot overturn a Supreme Court decision. It was vacated. And so the Korematsu decision, the legalization of racism, still stands. On September 24, 1987, Hirabayashi's conviction was vacated. The judge said, concluding from the evidence presented, General DeWitt was a racist and that his military orders were based upon racism rather than military necessity. So on August of 1988, President Reagan signed the Civil Liberty Acts of 1988, which would compensate the living survivors and offer an apology from the President of the United States. President Reagan remarked, "My fellow Americans, we gathered here today to right a grave wrong. More than 40 years ago, shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry living in the United States were forcibly removed from their homes and placed in makeshift internment camps. This action was taken without trial, without inquiry. It was based solely on race." A few years later, I received this letter from the White House offering sincere apology. And with that letter was this check for $20,000. In the year 2000, the city of Powell and the governor of Wyoming wrote letters to the Heart Mountain internees. We wish to acknowledge the difficulty and hardship faced by the internees and lack of consideration given to those housed at the Heart Mountain Relocation Center. Today, our citizens understand more clearly that each one of us is entitled to the rights of freedom, equality, and justice, regardless of ancestry. It is our hope and prayer that a similar situation is never repeated, and that we can work together to see that it does not happen again. I want to read the Executive Order 9066. Whereas the successful prosecution of war require every possible protection against espionage and against sabotage to national defense material, national defense premises, and national defense utilities, I here authorize and direct to prescribe military areas from which any or all person may be excluded. The Secretary of War is hereby authorized to provide for residents any such areas who are excluded therefrom such transportation, food, shelter, and other accommodation as may be necessary. And so we were excluded to prevent espionage and sabotage, and we were to be provided food and shelter as necessary. But the people in the interior of the United States didn't want that. And so they demanded that we be put into concentration camp, and so that's what happened. And so I want to show you this exclusion order. We did not get individual notices or letters telling us to report to the camp. This exclusion notice was, put on walls of a building or on telephone poles that gave us 6-day notice to report with only what you could carry. Boy, as a kid, I didn't know anything about this. But boy, today, when I read it, boy, it really hits me. With only what you can carry, with a 6-day notice. Okay, any questions? Well, maybe, let me say one thing before we ask a question. One of the most often asked questions is, why did we go? Well, our parents came from Japan. They were born in the late 1800s or around 1900. No, they came to America, in the late 1880s. And so they didn't speak or read English. The Niseis, or those born in America, the average age at that time was only 20 years old. Okay, so we didn't know anything. And we grew up, our parents grew up, you know, they were taught to obey. That's one thing about the Japanese people of those days. Well, we were just taught to obey. Obey the authority, your teachers, the school, you know, the policemen, everyone of authority, we were told to obey. And we were, you know, a very small minority group. You know, we went to segregated school, you know. And so, when we were told, you know, to go to the camp, we went. They told us, if you people, you know, if you are true Americans, you will go to the camp. That's your patriotic duty. If you are Americans, you will obey and go to the camp. And so that's what we did. We were a bunch of sheep. But, you know, that was one good part of the Japanese people is that we obeyed. Rosa Parks wasn't around. Martin Luther King wasn't around. There were no protest marches in those days. If we would have had, you know, had some marches or protests, maybe we wouldn't have to go to the camps. You know, I feel sorry for my father. He was only 44 years old. You know, we went through the Depression where we had nothing, you know, and now things were just getting better. You know, there was a war going on in Europe. You know, we bought a new tractor, and I knew I would be getting a brand new bicycle pretty soon. But the war started, and we were put into the camp. My father lost 10 years of his life. And so by the time he got going, it was too late. Let me read you another thing about one thing that I wrote. I'm a second generation. I'm a Nisei. I'm different from my children or their children. Okay. The Niseis and Iseis are grouped by themselves. I wrote this down and I want to tell you. I know that I am a minority, a Japanese American. I know that other Asians do not like Japanese due to Japan's atrocity during World War II. My Japanese friends tell me that some recent immigrant Asian shop owners are rude to Japanese. Everywhere I go, I notice the racial mix. Out where I live, it is almost totally Hispanic, so I blend in. In the Japanese American groups that I belong to, we started a redress drive to bring out the wrongs of the camp that led to the apology by the president and the redress payment. At the Heart Mountain campsite in Wyoming, we put up a memorial to honor the 15 Japanese American soldiers killed from that camp, to tell Wyoming that these soldiers gave their lives for them. We helped put up a replica to honor those serving in the armed forces from the camp, 800 names. We put up an interpretive learning center so that the people in the area of Wyoming know what we went through. We went after a Heart Mountain barrack to place it for exhibit at the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles so all can see how we live. At Washington, D.C., we put up a memorial to honor the 800 plus Japanese Americans who gave their lives during World War II and how they became the most decorated unit for its size and length of service. Here in Los Angeles, we, Japanese American Korean veterans, put up a memorial for the 250 Japanese Americans who were killed during the war in Korea. Then we put up a memorial in Korea to let them know that Japanese Americans served and gave their lives to save their country. So I am really conscious that I am a Japanese American and always trying to tell others that we are Americans too. But I am now 85 years old, a Nisei, a second generation Japanese Americans, and we are now coming to an end. I have 3 daughters. 2 are married to non-Japanese. The other married to a Japanese, but their only child goes around with a non-Japanese. So now we are almost at the end of Japanese Americans. So I am glad that we have finished with a recording of the history of the Japanese Americans. So in a few more years, there'll be no more of us. Okay, questions on what I covered? Yeah, we Japanese Americans who went through that World War II experience were a different breed of people. Were different from the younger generation Japanese Americans. All these younger people, they got white blood in them. Yes?
This is a quick question that you probably didn't ask ahead of time, but where did you get the nickname Baby?
My real name is Harumi. You know, that's a girl's name. But when we were little kids, all the Japanese kids picked up nicknames because, it's easier for the white people. So one day when I was a little kid, my brothers and friends had a little bonfire going. And so they put me over the bonfire like a piece of bacon. And so that's how I got my nickname. Yeah, so I'm glad I have that name. Boy, this Harumi is a girl's name. Boy. Yes. Any other questions? I hope I have been thorough, to explain. Today, we could sort of joke about what we went through. It's been a long, long time. And I could joke about it. But boy, I'm telling you, it was really tough in those days. It was really tough. And the discrimination that we faced. Yes, back there. You gotta say it loud enough.
Have you ever resented the U.S. government?
Huh? I still can't hear you.
Have you ever resented the U.S. government?
No. The U.S. government, they let us down during World War II. Yeah, they let us down. But right after camp, I had a lot of resentment against Japan. I had a lot of resentment. Because they're the one that bombed Pearl Harbor. If it weren't for Pearl Harbor, none of this would have happened. It was all due to Pearl Harbor. If Japan did all they did without Pearl Harbor, if they went on and conquered all of China and the Philippines, maybe no war would have happened with the U.S. See? But for a long time, I had a lot of anger towards Japan. But I have relatives back there. I've been back there, and I'll be going back there sometime again this year. So I still, Japan, that's where my parents come from. And so, I have, big ties with Japan. Yes.
I come from Japan, Tokyo, and I'm a teacher back in Tokyo. I have a question. What do you think, what is your image or your thought towards Japan has changed after 1945? Or is it still the same? Like, what do you think about Japan in the past? What do you think about Japan now? Do you think Japan has changed after 1945? Or do you think it hasn't changed? Like, it's the same country, just same as pre-World War II?
Well, for Japanese people of America and Japan, I have a lot of respect for the Japanese people of here in America and in Japan. In my opinion, and I think this is the general opinion, we Japanese were very well behaved, we were really very good people, before the war. Right after the war, we were really discriminated against, but, and we accepted. We, the Japanese, the majority of Japanese Americans accepted the camp life. I mean, it's all in the record. You just read, everything about what happened. The majority accepted, And so right after the camp, we were all poor, and we tried to work hard, and I'm telling you, there were industries that were looking for Japanese American workers because they were really industrious and trying to get ahead and trying to be accepted. You'll be surprised, that the white companies were looking for Japanese American workers. And so today, I look at Japan, it's a good country, I mean, they have their problems of their wartime atrocities and all that. And even today, I did a lot of research about Japan. You could find it all in the war crime trials right after World War II. That's where you find out the history of Japan. All the things that came out at the war crime trial. And our Japanese American Korean war veterans are going to Korea. We have this memorial over there with 250 names of Japanese Americans in Korea to show the Korean people that we Japanese Americans serve. And I was looking up in the internet, and then I came across this thing that the Korean people, they really hate the Japanese people. God, Japan and North Korea ranked the same at the bottom of the list. I was really amazed at that. But anyway, I believe that Japan is a very, very good country, and I'm not ashamed of being Japanese. I could say I'm a Nisei, and I'm proud to be a Nisei. To what we've gone through and all that, I wouldn't change my nationality to anything else. Yes?
When was the first time you were able to speak about everything that happened? When was the first time you felt comfortable talking about your experiences?
Okay. In 1982, we had our first reunion of those people at the Heart Mountain camp. Okay, we were there from 1942 to 1945. And so in 1982, we had our first reunion. Up to that time, I felt that, the camp was we had to go and we went. But I was asked to put on a slideshow about the camp. So then I started to read the books about the camp. I never read the books before then. And then I was amazed to find out how illegal the camp was. I didn't know a thing about it until then, because I just didn't read about it. We just accepted that the camp was okay. We just accepted that. And then from 1982, I started to read more and more. I went back to the campsite. I went to the libraries, and I studied it. Finally, I have spoken about 50 times about the camp. Yes, way back there.
I'm also Japanese. I came US a few days ago to study international relationships. So, what was the worst thing that you experienced at the camp?
What the worst
Experienced?
experience?
Yeah. What was the worst thing that you experienced at the camp?
I can't think of anything that I would consider worst or, that was really bad that I could remember. I was 13 through 15. I didn't know anything. I didn't read the newspaper or nothing. I was there just having fun. Okay, we didn't have anything. We didn't have anything. But without anything, you could go around the camp and have fun. And I can't think of any negative moment, let's say, I can't answer that. What's the worst moment? I'm sure that other people had it, but for me as a 13, 14, 15-year-old kid, I could just talk about, we went to Yellowstone, we went hiking, we went to the river, play in the snow, and that's all a kid remembers. I wish, some wrong. But it didn't happen to me. But I guess when I got out of camp, I went to this high school and I was all by myself. I was not discriminated against. I was ignored. See? But for most people who went to the Heart Mountain camp, for the teenagers, it was a big adventure. Because the kids didn't lose anything. It's their parents. The parents lost everything. They're the one that suffered. See? I think I gave you the wrong impression of the camp. But I didn't want to hide it, because then you could say, oh, you had all those kimonos in the camp and you guys are ice skating and all this, and so I have to bring it up. But it was a wrong that the president had to apologize and give us $20,000 apiece. It's called, one of the greatest blot in U.S. history. Okay, yes?
I would like to know your personal opinion about the official apology for the U.S. government by President Biden in the paycheck. Whether that contribute to the change of sentiment among Japanese Americans toward American people or the government, or does it one of those the reasons?
I think
because Japan is now facing a kind of pressure from the other Asian countries about, especially during war, especially women in Asia. and they're asking official word lessons. And
Okay.
so
I
I'd
think-
like to know if that helped Japanese Americans change their sentiment.
Yes. I think receiving that letter of apology made it official that the U.S. did wrong. Okay? The words may not, well, I think the words are good enough. You know, he said he's offering a sincere apology. You know, I think that's good enough. This letter that we received from Wyoming, well, that's not so good. But it's good enough.